Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sophie Hackett, the Curator of Photography at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And it's my great pleasure today to be in conversation with Deepali Dewan, who is the Dan Mishra Curator of South Asian Art and Culture at the Royal Ontario Museum, and a great colleague in photography here in the city. This is part of Shape of the Museum, an ongoing talk series that the AGO has been hosting since the shutdown, so for over a few months. But it's also, we're tying this in with another anniversary, which is 20 years of the photography department at the AGO. And I'm going to, this is the first, actually the second discussion I'm having with a colleague about photography collecting. We're doing that also with private collectors and thinking about the personal impulse to collect, but it was also important to me that we speak to colleagues in other institutions nearby about their collecting photographs and how that sort of overlaps with or is very different from what the AGO does. Deepali, this is also 20 years, in fact, of your department at the ROM, South Asian Art and Culture. Can you tell me a little bit about how the department came about?
Well, I don't know if I'd call it a department, but more of a section. It's part of the Department of Art and Culture at the ROM. And it's true, it's about 20 years. And, you know, it very much started because of an effort on the behalf of some volunteers in the South Asian community in Toronto, coming together and saying, you know, this is time that we have a South Asia gallery. And the first gallery opened in 2000. I actually arrived in 2002. And then I was part of creating a expanded version in the ROM's Renaissance ROM expansion. And that opened in 2008.
Right, just shortly before we launched the new Gary expansion of the AGO. So we've sort of had some parallel lives in some way. And I'm very struck by that, by the South Asian community coming forward and talking to the ROM's leadership, well, the volunteers who were already part of the infrastructure of the museum, but coming forward and saying, you know what, we don't, well, maybe it's a version of this, that we don't see ourselves here. We want to see ourselves here, and we want to help make that happen. That's really extraordinary. I hadn't heard that part of your sort of story to come.
Well, apparently at the time, it was the first instance of this kind of thing in North America.
Wow, that's amazing. Go ROM. Go ROM volunteers.
Or go community. Go community.
Wow. So when you arrived in 2002, you had a gallery for South Asian art, but what collection was in fact here, if any?
Well, I mean, even though the ROM sort of didn't have a gallery, you know, or a curator until the 2000s, in fact, they have been collecting South Asian art as part of their general Asian collecting from the beginnings of the museum. And so when I came, you know, there was a lot of kind of opening cupboards, opening doors, trying to figure out what was there. And what's interesting is that, you know, when they had posted the position that I eventually got, they had actually advertised for someone who was a specialist in medieval sculpture. And I think it was just a result of like, that's how you posted for a South Asia curator, like in general, because it's not like I was actually interested or qualified for that part of it. Right. But when I came for my interview, I actually discovered that there was really interesting 19th century, you know, kind of colonial hybrid decorative art stuff and the kind of things that are really interesting to think about, but oftentimes people don't really value in their collections. And there was actually very little or smaller amount of sort of medieval sculpture. And it got me really excited. And I realized that the ROM was, you know, being part of an institution that was, you know, sort of part of the British Empire. It received things in ways that, let's say, other museums that have South Asia collections in North America hadn't. So while the US, for example, had collections that were largely built by industrial philanthropists, private collectors, the ROM had this kind of hodgepodge of colonial ephemera, and that had come here because Canada was part of the, you know, one end of the British Empire. And to me, that was super interesting to think about. And it's stuff that I hadn't really seen in the books that I studied in grad school or elsewhere. And it actually turned out to be very interesting and a good fit.
Amazing. Well, we can maybe touch on some of those, some of the things you raised in a moment. But so that's really, I find that very Your specialty is, of course, the history of photography, or one of your areas of expertise, the history of photography, even specifically in 19th century India. So I'm thrilled that they hired you, the medieval sculpture gap, maybe notwithstanding. Can you tell us a little bit about what you have built in the last 18 or so years since you've been here? I think you might have some images to share.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've had an interest in photography from the beginnings, and when I came to the ROM, there wasn't really a photography collection. We don't have a photography department, but because of my own research interests, I was interested to find out what was there. And, you know, for example, you know, I came across a whole group of photographs from the studio called Skeen and Company, which was active in Sri Lanka in the turn of the century. And, you know, I was thrilled and happy to find them, but just was wondering, like, actually it turned out that there was one of the images that was blown up as a poster in one of the hallways of the Curatorial Center. And I kept going around asking people, like, what is this image? Where is it? Is it ours? Is it someone else's? And it took a while, but, you know, finally we kind of found, you know, the collections technician told me that she had found a group of these images kind of curled up in the corner somewhere and had spent time, you know, flattening them out. And it turns out that there was these group of images. But the interesting thing is that because of Ram's history, photographs came in not as artworks or artifacts, but they came in as illustrations or contextual data for the objects that the institution was collecting. And so I think my feeling is that these Sri Lankan images were coming in, let's say, with a set of Sri Lankan objects. Actually, there's a bunch of, I don't know, spheres or something like that that we got from what was called the Imperial Institute in London. And I have a feeling they came in as a kind of contextual information for that. But now, you know, they are very interesting artworks, artifacts in and of themselves. And so it was one of the first photo collections that I actually accessioned. You know, I said, no, we need numbers on these. We need to accession these. We need to catalog these. And so from there, you know, I started also building the collection. And I have some images to share, just to sort of share the kinds of things that were interesting to me in terms of building the collection. And I'll just
and maybe as you do that, following on the group of Skeen photographs, of course, did you ever find out, so the Sri Lankan objects, were they part of your area or the area of art and culture, or were they in archaeology, or were you able to even find that? There was probably no documentation with them, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, there was no documentation, but they were part of the art and culture archive, the Asian section's archive. And there were other ones along that way. Since then, you know, I've been actively collecting, and part of it has been to fill gaps, you know, and think about what does a collection of South Asian photography look like? What should it have in it? But a lot of it's also been about research that I want to do. So, you know, bringing together a collection so that it can be researched, so that there can be a project around it. And I did a project around the photographer Raja Deen Dayal, wrote a book, co-authored a book on it. And he was a well-known Indian 19th century photographer. And now the ROM has one of the largest collections of his photographs in North America. And I'm happy to say I think we have like 12 out of the 16 albums that he's known to have produced. So it gets to be this, collecting becomes an opportunity to try to really get at the texture of one photographer's career, you know, to be able to have a collection of things to get at some of those details. On the other hand, I think one of the things that I really thought about is trying to collect in ways that filled photo history. So I've been really interested in thinking about, you know, what are the stories that aren't told in our histories of photography? And in that way, I've collected things that weren't necessarily considered, you know, great in terms of aesthetic value or even condition, but I've been drawn to things that maybe aren't in the best of condition, but that actually really tell different kinds of stories about the history of photography. And so, for example, I'm just showing you here some carte de visites by a photographer named Harichand Chintaman. And he was active in Bombay in the 1870s and 80s. And, you know, this is a photographer, I was so excited to see some of these images. We have a whole bunch of carte de visites and other work by him now. But there's still very little known about him. But these types of images, for me, start to fill in some of those gaps. And so, for example, just the different evolution of his letterpress on the back of the carte de visite sort of shows this evolution of his photo studio work. And also the types of images. Let's see if I can, here we go. Also shows you more about the practice of photography in India at the time. And I'll just share this one because I love it so much. So this is a carte de visite that has Harichan Chintaman's studio mark on it. But do you recognize who this guy is?
I don't know.
So I didn't either. And it was just a weird image to me. But sometimes it's the writing on the back that is equally or even more important for me for a lot of photographs. And the way I look at photographs is I have to see, the back is one of the main sources of information. And the back of this one actually says that it says, America ka Badshah Uska Naam Grant. So it's saying, this is America's emperor. His name was Grant. And it was so interesting. So this is Ulysses S. Grant.
Amazing.
And it's an image, that's being marketed by an Indian photographer in Bombay in the 1870s. So what that raises for me is, in some ways, an issue of circulation. Where did he get this image? Turns out Ulysses S. Grant actually made a world tour after the end of his presidential terms, and ended up in Bombay, in India, in 1879. Now, I don't think he sat for Hari Chintaman, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why I think that. And also because this particular photograph is actually a view of Grant and his younger days, not the way he looked when he went on his tour. But that tells me that for some reason, there were some images circulating. I wouldn't be surprised if he issued this when Grant, stopped in India.
Sure.
And it was directed, the writing on the back tells me it's directed to a local audience. And so, this is all about sort of an Indian audience, an Indian photographer creating images for an Indian audience and framing it in very local terms. So he isn't America's president, he's America's emperor. Badshah is a term used for the kind of a Persian term for the highest, most emperor, and writing his name is Grant, rather than saying, this is Ulysses S. Grant, as if people already know him. And so this to me, just sort of tells a different part of that story of photography. And of course, carte de visites being kind of a way that celebrity was being produced and made at the time too.
For sure. Well, and it was not unusual. William Notman, for instance, had designation of photographer to the Queen and could reproduce images of Queen Victoria and her family. Sarah Bernhardt, very well-known singer, images proliferated and were licensed to different photographers throughout the world. So it's interesting to see this local version. Have you been able to figure out who actually made the initial photograph?
Right. No, I haven't. And I haven't dug in that deep yet. But clearly he's copying someone's image and he's marketing it. So this is a savvy photographer trying to make a buck, in colonial India.
That's an amazing story.
Just to share a couple other things that are along these lines of, thinking about what stories have been left out of photo history and how to add to them. I was saying that, condition is sometimes not the criteria for me in terms of collecting. And this is an example. This is a really interesting album that came in to the collection. That's a studio sample book. And it doesn't clearly say which studio's book it belonged to, but just going through the pages and seeing some of the wet stamps that were randomly placed, and in fact, some of the images, it's clear that it belonged to this one studio called Kaiser-e-Hind Photo Studio. And the name of that photo studio, Kaiser-e-Hind, is actually the name that Queen Victoria adopted, I think in the late 1860s, only for a little bit of time. So it gives us a kind of, chronological kind of range for when the studio was in operation. It literally means Empress of India. So, and And what I see here is it's a really interesting, and I have never heard of this studio before. So as far as I know, this is the only document of this studio's production, and how long they existed, I'm not sure. But the sample book makes clear the range of photographic subject matter and styles that the studio was working with at this early time. You know, you have everything from the kind of ethnographic photography that one would expect in the colonial period, you know, for example, the palanquin bearers in this top, you know, left-hand side, and the snake charmer, right? I mean, these are images that are still kind of stereotypical tourist images out of India. And yet you also have, for example, an image of a painting of an Indian god and goddess. And so it makes me think about the audience that might be around for this kind of image. It gives an insight into the commercial practice of the studio at the time. You can see at the top of the page on the left, it says all at 6 annas each, right? So thinking about like how much did photographs cost? On the right-hand side, the landscape view says 12 annas next to it. And, you know, I'm convinced that some of these images weren't taken by the studio itself. So there was a culture of copying that was going on at the time that was really all about commercial enterprise. And then there's some of these amazing images that I'm not clear who it's for, but it's actually showing a telegraph being delivered. And that was, you know, a very new technology at the time. And you know, Christopher Pinney is one scholar who's written about how photography and the telegraph as modes of communication that went across different distances very quickly were related, you know, in terms of creating a certain culture. But in this image, you can actually see the photography studio sign in the background.
I love that. That's amazing. I actually wondered, I mean, I guess it does say telegraph underneath. When I saw this initially, I thought, oh, someone is taking receipt of their pictures. They've been to the studio and have had their photographs taken, and now it's the photographer making a self-portrait essentially of their as business person. But I guess the telegraph makes sense that it's there. I love these kinds of pictures.
And so these are the kinds of clues that you can find in what is a pretty grubby looking album, right? But it reveals a whole chapter in Indian photography that you wouldn't really get to know otherwise. I did a project on painted photographs and wanted to include this because, you know, I would say now painted photographs from India have become much more widely known. But at the time, you know, for me, it was... Well, and this is kind of the beauty, but also the challenge of being in a position to collect, right, and making collections. And I'm sure you experienced this too, where, you know, for me, I try to fill gaps and try to tell other stories, and then you make a collection and you do a project, and then it kind of becomes a bit more mainstream. Mm-hmm. So for me, I'm always thinking about, well, what's that other thing that, you know, what aren't we talking about right now? You know, what isn't, you know, what is a story that hasn't yet to be told? And so there's always this process of trying to think about what's that next thing. And painted photographs for me was one of them. And one of the things that I was really attracted to with creating a collection of painted photographs is this idea that, you know, for me, painted photographs really questioned the idea of thinking about photography only in terms of its index. Right. It really questioned this idea of that it was, you know, photography replaced painting, and it was a more real way of representing the world. And this is the dominant way, you know, that photography kind of took over the other arts. And in India, that was not the case, you know. So this is a history that needed to be told. And I love this image because I think it really brings together the different ways these two mediums, paint and photography, interacted with each other. So for example, you know, you can see how the artist has actually put paint right on the photographic image to embellish, for example, a curtain and a carpet that just wasn't decorative enough. And then on the other hand, and this is what I love, is that photography was not necessarily only a tool for the artist, but it was also a style. But what I mean by that is, you know, on the right, you know, if you go back to the overview, a lot of people have talked about how painted photographs in India left the face and the hands unpainted,
Right.
left the photograph showing through. But in fact, by collecting these painted photographs and looking at them super closely, what we were able to tell was that, in fact, in most cases, the hands and the face weren't the photographic print. It was paint being used to mimic the aesthetic of a photograph. So it was meant to fool the eye. And so in that way, it was also, so this kind of mixture of thinking about photography differently was important to me in this type of thing. And then some of the most recent things that I've been collecting, as you know, have been a different kind of vernacular photography that often gets categorized as family photos. And I did a project called The Family Camera with several colleagues here in Toronto, and trying to create a collection where family photos can then become data, become sources that can be used in photo histories in the future. And the whole project—
And you had a really unique approach to that, that is that, we're often with family photographs, or often they are collected without much information surrounding them. They're often sort of orphaned, or they get called found photographs, as though they were lost in the first place. So you had a really particular methodology for going about that.
That's right. And so with this collecting, provenance was really important. And for us, getting images directly from the family so that it could be still connected to their oral histories. So they're not anonymous images, so that there is some history of how they were used gets reflected. And I love these because these are images that were part of Michael de Souza's collection. His family migrated from Goa to Pakistan. And then he and most of his siblings migrated from Pakistan to Canada in the late 60s, early 70s. And these are, and so that project also looked at how family photos are mixed up with experiences of migration and movement, but also the lack of movement. And so sometimes photographs can travel when people can't, right? And so once they migrated, these are photographs that actually he sent back to his parents. And if you can see, on the back of one of the photographs, he says to Ma and Pa, don't be shocked. So it's, it's a way of like sort of updating his family on them. And so for me, family photographs are one of the most ubiquitous category of photography out there. And yet it's the one that seems to be the most absent from photo history still. And so how do we change that? Well, part of it is actually having the materials available for historians to write new histories in the future.
Did the project, it's, I believe is collecting ongoing in this project, or have you sort of capped it at this stage? Because you collected many thousand family photographs as part of this initiative, is that right?
Yeah, it was a project that was with the ROM and with the Archives, formerly the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archive. And between the two, we collected, I think it was about 17,000 photos with about 40 oral histories, or more than 40 oral histories. And it was part of a SHIRK grant project, and that grant is now over, although the sort of thinking about what would the second part of that project look like is something we're doing right now.
And how do you think, when you had to talk to the leadership at the ROM about this project, what did you tell them about why it mattered?
That's a good question. I didn't have to do much selling at all. Like, this was something that was embraced pretty quickly. And I think for them, one of the attractive things about the project was how meaningful it would be for audiences. And, as something that connects with them right away. And so this is, for me, it was also a little bit about letting go of curatorial authority and actually collaborating with people on what do you want to see in the collection? What part of your history would you like to see, preserved in this, big institution? And being part of authoring that was an important part of it.
On that point of giving over curatorial authority, I think it's something where authority and who has who runs museums and who has access to museums is very much a live conversation. It has, I mean, it always is, but it has a particular, I think, intensity these days. And, you know, we both work in institutions that were founded in the early 1900s. Toronto was a different place. The role of museums was different. And I'd say both institutions are firmly shaped in relation to the British Empire. So that sense of how do you think about relinquishing curatorial authority, you know, as a move? How do you think about that? And why is it important to you to relinquish that authority? Why do that? Given that you've trained and you've done all the things you've done to gain the position you have.
Well, I mean, I think it's this position of questioning any kind of top-down narrative, which has been motivating my collecting practice, the research topics I chose to work on, sort of all aspects of my work. And so it's kind of funny, you know, I mean, when I first started at the ROM in 2002, you know, the ROM had a logo with a little crown on top of its O. I don't know if you remember that.
I don't.
So, you know, things have changed in the last 20 years. You know, that logo is gone, but some of the colonial legacies of museums is still very much there. And this is a question I think that comes up when we think about photography in general, you know, as a medium. Yeah. And, you know, Ariella Azule has written more recently about, you know, just the profound kind of colonial roots of photography as a medium itself, not only being a tool of empire, but in fact being created out of it, right? But also having empire created out of photography as a medium. And so the two having these kind of really deep connective tissues that you can't separate them out. And so I think saying this out loud and acknowledging these things is a big part of that process. Yeah. And for me, you know, in many ways, photography and the study of photography has been, you know, both as challenge as well as a lot of potential for how to dismantle some of that. And so, you know, thinking about photography, you know, photography has a way of being super slippery. You know, it's often used, you know, for, you know, to capture, and then it often gets used for, you know, freedom as well. And so these both things, you know, photographs often don't end up getting used for the purposes that they were originally meant to either. And so photographs have this really slippery way of being both, you know, of having potential for something. And it's about defining what that something is. And I think that something keeps evolving. And so I guess there is a certain degree of faith that I have that there is potential through this collecting practice as one way to start dismantling some of these old relationships that, you know, were part of the formation of the institution.
You've recently, in your book Embellished Reality, which was the book that accompanied the exhibition in 2012, that the painted photograph that you showed is the cover of, in fact. The subtitle of that book talks about, sort of relays, you're aiming for a transcultural history of photography in India. And I'm very struck by that even so many years later as such an important initiative. Just lost my train of thought for a second about the question. I guess you're also now working on a larger history. It's been a multi-year project about the history of photography in India more broadly. And you mentioned to me that you're trying to bring it together, if possible, without actually relying on the British Library as a resource. Why is that important to you, and why do you think it would be meaningful now?
So there's a whole bunch of things there in that question. Yeah. Maybe I'll just start with
whichever thread you feel.
You know, when I first took on that, you know, painted photography project, painted photographs of India have been used as a way to highlight what has been unique about Indian photography. And to some degree that is true. But the more and more that I looked into it, you know, I realized that the mix of photography and paint has been going on in many places in the world since the beginning of photography. And so it's not necessarily this unique thing that is, you know, only about this one place. And in some ways, it was a way of kind of adding to a kind of exoticizing narrative of this one place of, oh, look how different from Western photography it is. Well, Western photography had paint and photo as a mix, and and certainly like the Notman studio shows many examples of that. And so I guess I was interested in that book to start thinking about in what ways can photo history learn from painted photographs in India, yet at the same time, think about them as part of a larger transcultural practice. And that's not easy, right? I mean, I feel like we're still evolving language, and how do you even write about that? How do you, articulate that kind of history? And I'm not sure I'm there yet. I'm not sure the field is there yet. But I guess this is something, that's why it's a towards. That's why the word towards is really important in the title. It's trying to do that. And in some ways I'm still, struggling and wanting to do more of that. I mean, it will challenge all of us in terms of our area specialties. It'll challenge us in terms of even the way we write history, right? History writing itself. But heading off into kind of the project that I'm working on right now, it is, and has been for a long time, and I have to say I feel a lot of guilt about this, is that I'm trying to get over so I can get over to actually do the project. But
we want to see it. I want to see it.
I've been in the process of writing, a book about the history of photography in India for a long time, and there is this play that one has to do in the writing process of, and I would say photo history everywhere, of where you want to go local, but you want to keep connected to the global, right? And so there is this sense of, it's challenging, it's hard, and but it's, I do feel like it's worthwhile. Like I have, and I feel like this is the direction to go in. And one of the things that I have been doing so far and toying with is so much of the work that's been done thus far about the history of photography in India relies on that colonial archive at the British Library, and so it's like the histories you can tell will come out of what you choose to use as your evidence, right? What you choose to use as your building blocks. And so what does that mean for the history of Indian photography to be largely coming out of a colonial archive? And then the next question is, well, what would it mean for a history of Indian photography to come not out of a colonial archive? Right. And I guess that's kind of the question that I'm exploring. Mm-hmm. And I would say, I would point to the work that the Al-Qazi collection of photography in New Delhi, the curator Rahab Alana there's been a whole series of publications that have actually come out of that collection. And that's a collection that has been built both from, I would say, the international art market, but also very much based in India, the material that has still circulated there. And so that's, I would look to that as a project that has been doing that. And so I've been trying to play with that as well in this book project. And even I think I mentioned to you that, what would it mean to maybe focus on archives that are in Canada largely?
Yeah, that would be incredible if we could make that happen. Is it your sense, I know you've gone back to India many times on different research trips, is it your sense that there are repositories of photographs that are yet to be uncovered, or even yet to be reckoned with in a way that, do you have a sense that there's a sort of, I don't know, there's always that feeling sometimes with photography that there's always a trove somewhere, like Hollis Frampton's kind of creature, the structure that's floating and bobbing in the water that someone is convinced is treasure and then manages to jackhammer it open, and then it's just photographs. But there's always this sort of iceberg of pictures there to be discovered.
I would say absolutely. And I think in India, there's still the best photo archives are still in people's cupboards and trunks and under the bed. And archives like that are very much still coming out. I'll give you one example. One of the things that I've been really fascinated with for a while since doing this project on Raja Deen Dayal is this idea of Zenana photography. And so in the latter half of the 19th century, several Indian photo studios announced in English language newspapers that they were opening a Zanana studio, which basically meant a studio for women who were keeping a lifestyle of parda, so where they would not be seen by men who weren't related to them, so out of the kind of public gaze. And it was a practice that was done by a lot of elite families and royal families in India. But, you know, women, when photography came around, this idea of a male photographer and going to the studio would have meant breaking parda. And so the studios announced, okay, well, we have a female photographer that we've trained now.
Oh, amazing.
And, you know, and they can come to your home. And the idea is that even the photographic negative would not be taken back by the studio. It would be left with the sitter. Okay.
Wow.
And
That's
so
a whole other research then to try and connect the practice of that photographer.
And my suspicion is that most of those negatives are still with family collections, right? Do they have a studio stamp on them? I don't know. You know, did the print get printed right? So how did they function? So one is a question of, they were announced in the newspapers, but I have yet to see evidence of those images. So to what degree were they put into practice, I think is a question that photo historians still need to answer. And then how could we actually identify those archives? I mean, it's like a Zanana studio that did its job really well, which is to keep that away from a public gaze. And so that is super fascinating to me.
Well, and even I suppose if the function of those pictures was in fact not to have a public presence at all, it was really a very perfectly circumscribed domestic context, then what is it, you know, how do you you can study them, but then how do you show them or publish them, given that, or can you, even if
and there is that ethics of that as well.
Yeah. Maybe just one last question for you before we open it up to those who may be listening. So 20 years in Toronto, give or take 18 years, I guess, specifically. What have you noticed has changed about the way about the photography scene here?
Yeah, you know what? I don't even know how to answer that. I don't know if I could even define what is the photo scene here.
Sure.
You know,
sure.
I mean, I would say one thing that I've noticed is that, you know, I think in the last 20 years, you know, Toronto has really emerged as a center of photography, much as it has been a center of film. You know, there are numerous great programs going on in town, and in some ways that has only helped my efforts at the ROM to see that kind of activity and support. You know, but I guess on the other hand, I don't know, I've kind of always felt like an outsider, so I don't even know how to define what the scene is. And you know, after some time, you just kind of get comfortable in that position of outsider, and, you know, and in some ways even prefer it.
Well, I think, you know, referring to a singular scene is misleading, because I think there are many scenes, and I think that's, there are the artists, there are the scholars, there are the curators, then we of course all overlap in different ways, and there are the different institutions and their characters there, and including university institutions. And I agree that I think it's, you know, we've had a number of different people arrive from other places and be like, whoa, what's happening here? What's in the water in Toronto? That photography is everywhere and everything. And I don't know how to answer to that question either, except it's taken root and it's here, and it's wonderful to be surrounded by colleagues like you to be able to talk about shared interests and think about how to broaden the stories of the history of the medium, which is something that is very close to and very important to me as well. So first of all, thank you for your remarks so far. I think they've given you a great insight into the way that you've both collected in depth, but also collected in ways to try and expand the history of photography in South Asia and beyond. If there are questions from the audience, we're happy to answer some. For those of you who are listening, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and questions will be routed to us. All right. So first question, how do you see the future of photography curating when personal online archives essentially die with the photographer, in particular family photography? So there are a few strands there. So it's about the way that we make pictures digitally primarily now, and how does that, did you collect digital born images, for instance, as part of the family camera project?
Yeah, that is a decision we made, and we did collect born digital images. And that, as you know, is, I think, a new direction for photo collecting in institutions. One, institutions aren't set up for that. Like, they don't know how to deal with it. And in some ways, my solution wasn't to not necessarily wait around to get the permission. I just sort of started doing it, and then approached, my colleagues of like, okay, well, how do we store these and how do we catalog them and stuff? And I had, a student to start thinking about how to actually catalog born digital things. It's not so many centimeters by so many centimeters, the measurement, for example, like, you have to sort of measure things in pixels, but, how do you preserve something in a cold storage in the cloud? Because once you collect something, you are making a promise to keep it there forever. And, it's something that I think still needs wrapping your head around. Like, I think institutions need to kind of wrap their head around. I do find film departments much more prepared to do that, and have been for a while, and have been leading the way on how to collect born digital photo-based technology. But I know that, conversations that I've had with my colleagues, like in the registrar department, some of them were just like plugging their ears saying, please stop talking, but still open to helping me, but still it is an entire differently way of thinking about what is an artifact and how do you deal with it. Yeah. That said, I think it's a great way for institutions to be pushed to be thinking differently, right? So these technologies will push them. The issue of family photography, yeah, I think is a major deal, and I don't have answers for that. I wouldn't be surprised if people's wills will now start having places for what are your passwords, your login name and passwords, for key digital assets, key digital possessions, unless maybe that's already happening, I don't know. How do you preserve them? How do you access them after someone is gone? Are a version of a question that was already there. And even with analog photographs, like what's going on in an image after great grandmother passes away is an issue, unless she's written down a whole bunch of stuff. I found in the family camera project, it took about 2 generations, and then people start not knowing who's in the photo, right. And so there's already in some ways loss that happens. That's just a part of family photography. And the digital world might actually have potential for saving some of that in ways that we weren't able to before. But then it does also seem, there's an ephemerality that, a different kind of ephemerality.
Sure. And I guess I can maybe comment a little bit on the part of that question that talks about curating online. Again, that's not something we've done that's happened very much. I think our current moment of a lot more Zoom and coming up to speed with, communicating online however we can, is forcing us to think more about how to make accessible what we do, how to make accessible our collections, and I think it highlights where we're behind in certain digitization initiatives. Certainly the AGO, we could have more digitized and more online. I think there's always that tension. I believe in the object and the object's sort of uniqueness, and that the experience of the object in person and the experience of the object online is different. It's mostly been cast as negatively different, and I think we have to start to think about how else to show it. I'm working currently with a writer who's writing about a collection of family photographs, actually, and she's based in the US, and of course our border is closed currently. She hasn't physically seen the collection and may not before the deadline of this piece of writing. So we're gonna actually experiment on Monday, this coming Monday, where I'm just gonna sit in front of a screen, we'll open a Zoom, and I'm just gonna show her some pictures, and we're gonna see how that goes. Not talk, just show front, back, try to give her a sense of the object itself. We'll see how that works, but they're definitely challenges.
Scale, and it'll give a sense of the tactileness of it. It's just that she herself won't be touching, I suppose.
Yeah. So there's less autonomy there. She'll have to rely on asking me what to do if she wants to see one again, or we'll have to see how that goes. But all right, looking at a couple of other questions have popped up here. Let me just read for one quick second. There's one additional question about family camera, in fact. Was the option provided to donate only a digital copy plus recording their story? So I guess that is the born digital image. Did you in fact make, to add on to that, so yes, you did collect digital images, yes. But did you make physical copies of those actually?
Not as artifacts. So the digital image was the artifact, and how do you number that without changing the original file was a question as well. So there was that, and then we made a printout, but it wasn't necessarily to display. It was like, how you have a cylinder box in storage, and you might have let's say analog photographs printed out on in the box. You have like a sheet right at the top that lists out, this is just collection management issues, where you just have a sheet that summarizes what's in the box, right? So we did a similar version of that. So there is the digital copy in storage, but we do have like a box of printouts of our digital stuff that aren't to be used. They're just for reference, to say, if you're just browsing through the collection, you come across that, that there's another room where there's more photo images.
And then the kind of related part of that question was that if some family didn't want to give their photograph to the ROM, was there an option to leave a digital version of that object with you, and would you collect that?
That was definitely an option at the archives. And there were various reasons why families wanted to participate or why they hesitated, and the project was very much meant to be seen as, it should feel like a win for everybody, that it should never feel like a loss. Mm-hmm. If giving your family photograph into a collection felt like a loss, then I encourage people not to give. They should keep them. If family photos still had a function within the domestic space for people, and then it should stay there for as long as it needs to. But there was an awful lot of families who were at the point in this kind of digital transition age where they had analog images, they didn't want to throw them out, but they didn't know how to keep them or what to do with them. And so it was sort of meeting that and trying to preserve those collections before they would go into an estate sale or a used bookshop or, on eBay now, and be separated from the oral histories.
Okay, maybe one last question here. This one is about photography and colonialism. So would you include photographs that were made across India post-partition, so in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s? Do you consider those still part of a colonial conversation, or should they be treated or discussed separately?
If I'm understanding the question right, I would say both. Trying to excavate as much the original context of a photographic image in terms of how it was made, who it was made for and by, is an important part of that. And if something was made post-independence, it would be very much about a different period in India's history or South Asia's history. That said, photography as a colonial medium, as a medium that, where imperialism and colonialism are part of its tissue, I think the legacies of colonialism remain part of the conversation. And so everything from, you know, the very technology of the click and the shutter and the, you know, these are some of the things that Arya Azoulay and others have talked about. Those things can't be separated out.
No. Well, I think that's a good, an excellent note to end on. The conversation will continue, the work will continue. Deepali, thank you so much for your time today. Great to see objects from the ROMS collection, and I will follow, as always. I know we'll continue to talk about photography and what you're up to. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon rather, and I wish you a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks.